My head is paining. Hi guys, I'm Pallak and welcome back to another video of Discovering Horizons, where in each week I try to learn a new skill or try something new. So for this week's video, we're going to be trying watercolor pencils with Pallak. Watercolor pencils are essentially color pencils which are soluble in water. So what this means is that when you add water to the pigment, it makes a very watercolor paint-like effect. So this can be used in a variety of ways to create a bunch of different effects and to make stunning artwork. So let's go. Let's start with the materials. For the paper, I'm going to be using the Canson's watercolor paper, and it is best to use a watercolor paper if you're going to be adding water to the pigment because the paper can hold a lot more and you can layer very easily. But if you're going only for color pencils, then you can use any kind of drawing paper that you like. Another paper that I absolutely love and I'm going to be using is the Hindustan's 100% cotton paper, and I think I have spoken about this so many times before. It is absolutely amazing. It is 300 GSM, which means that it is extremely thick and can take as many layers of painting as possible. Moving on to the actual watercolor pencils, I will be using the Staedtler's Luna range, which is the watercolor pencil range by Staedtler, and this actually works really well for me. It's very beginner friendly. This is the only watercolor pencils that I have been using for the past 4 years now, ever since college. I use this as both normal color pencils as well as watercolors, and they work great in both. I also want to say that these are not the best quality pencils that you can get out there. There are tons of artist quality pencils if you're looking to invest in them. They have a higher amount of pigmentation, which means that it works a lot better, the colors a lot brighter, and yeah, if you want you can check those out. But for me, these work great, so this is what I'm going to stick to. And finally, in terms of paint brushes, I'm going to be using the Camlin and the fine art ones. These work very well again for beginners. For watercolor pencils, you don't need too many brushes. Just a round and a flat works very well. Another brush that I'm going to be using is the Sakura's water brush pen. So this works really well, especially for watercolor pencils, because it holds its own water. So I don't have to use a separate container for that. Today we're going to be trying all the basic techniques of watercolor pencils. I started by dividing my page into 11 different sections, and for any of these techniques and methods, I would suggest using a thick watercolor paper for the best results. So starting with the first technique, I'm just using the color pencil as is, and I've already spoken about this in a previous video, so you can check that out. For the next square, I'm just filling it in with an even coat of dark color and going over it with a damp brush to get this solid wash of color. Next, to get a blended effect, I'm laying down one color on one side and another color on the other side, slightly blending the both in the middle, and then going over it with a damp brush, starting from the lighter color moving up, blending the colors as I go. For the next technique, I'm starting with applying water evenly all over the paper and then going over it with the color pencil. This leads to a very bright, pigmented and slightly blended look, and I usually use this technique to create textures like you can see. Next, for a graded effect, I'm starting with coloring the space, going from a dark to a light gradient and going over with a damp brush, starting at the darkest end and adding more water as I go to create this graded effect. Another way of getting the same effect is adding a dark layer of color at one end and going over it with a damp brush, pulling the color as I go to create this graded effect. For the next effect, I'm again starting with applying a layer of water, and then using a blade, I scratched off small bits of different colors and sprinkled them on top of the damp paper to get this textured effect. For the next square, I'm running my color pencil over a damp brush to get this watercolor effect and testing it a little. Following a similar approach, next I took a flat brush and added two different colors on the two ends to create this blended effect. And once my sprinkle section was semi-dry, I went over with a damp brush and just blended the colors in a little to make the effect stand out a little more. Now for my final effect, which is something that I recently discovered when I was researching for this video, and it has to be my favorite. So this is called a palette technique, where I'm going to lay a very thick coat of the colors like this, and then when I add a little water to it, it acts like a watercolor cake which I can then use to paint. So not only does this create that amazing transparency that can be difficult to achieve with watercolor pencils, it also creates a very mobile and compact travel palette that you can easily use on the go. Today we're going to be trying a few different ways in which we can layer watercolor pencils to create depth, shadows, highlights and all of that good stuff. So let's go. So I'm going to start by experimenting with two different types of layers. I first painted both my squares with a light layer using the palette and blending technique. And then when both the layers were completely dried, on the first square I am adding another layer with the palette technique just to see how that works in comparison with the other square where I am going over with the color pencil and then blending it in with a damp brush. As you can see, the effect is slightly different, which can be used for two different moods or results. Moving on to creating lights and shadows, I made my classic sphere, and for the first one, I'm going to be blending all the colors using the pencils first, all at once, blending the colors in as I go, but also making sure to not leave any harsh particular lines because that can show up very easily after I add the water. And then going over this with a damp brush, blending the colors from the lightest to the darkest for this effect. For my second sphere, I really wanted to test working in layers. So I first colored my base color in and then blended it with a damp brush. And while this was semi-dry, I added my second color in using the pencil and again blended this in using a damp brush. Another thing to note here is the quality of the paper because that can break or make your watercolor effect. In this case, since I'm applying so many layers one on top of the other and using so much water, having a thick quality paper does help me achieve this effect a lot easier because if it was a thin paper, it would wrinkle very easily. I then repeated the same process with my darkest color. I think working with the pencils all at once gave a very transparent effect when compared with the second sphere, which was very bright and pigmented, as you can clearly see. And now finally, I think I have a better understanding of how to create certain visuals and effects using all of these methods. Finally, now that we know the basics of watercolor pencils, let's move on to creating the final artwork. And for this, I want to create a very layered floral piece. So let's go. To start with, I drew on a sunflower, the reference for which I took from Pinterest. And I'm filling the inside of the flower with a very light coat of yellow ochre mixed with a little bit of brown using the palette technique. And while this layer is still wet, I'm going over this wet page with my color pencil and drawing small circles to mimic the texture of the sunflower seeds. I'm also adding some blacks and greys as I go to add more depth. For the petals, I started by coloring them in with a bright yellow as my base and then blending it with a damp brush. And when this layer was completely dried, I added some details and lines using an orange pencil, and I decided I liked the raw feeling of the pencil line on the smooth paint, so I left it like that without blending it with water. Then, to connect the petals with the inner part of my flower, I took a dark brown and using the palette technique, I am sort of extending the brown from the inner circle to the gaps in between the petals like so to add another layer of depth. With this, I'm done with my main flower And moving on to the stems, I'm combining green with brown for a muted olive green-like color using the palette technique. And for my leaves, I'm coloring in some light green and yellow and then blending those two with a damp brush. I then went over this with some brown to give it some more depth and finished the whole artwork with some green lines and strokes on the leaves and a very light wash of blue using the palette technique for my background. And this is how it turned out at the end. Finally, if you watched till the very end, thank you so much. If you liked the video, then please make sure to like, share and subscribe. And let me know in the comments what you'd like to see. And I'll see you next time.